Over 70% of the countries in the world have abolished the death penalty. The United States is not one of them. Today, I'm going to tell you why the United States needs to abolish the death penalty and instead replace it with the sentencing of life without the possibility of parole. The death penalty is a corrupt and immoral practice that has killed hundreds of innocent lives and is costing taxpayers millions of dollars a year. I chose this issue of the death penalty because I am a strong opponent to the government being able to execute its citizens, as well as the fact that the death penalty is still very relevant today. As of today, there are 737 current cases in California of inmates on death row. I'm going to show you why the death penalty needs to go and instead replaced with life without the possibility of parole. Now, for starters, as I mentioned, the death penalty is very, very expensive. The process of placing an inmate on death row can cost the state millions of dollars a year. This process is so drawn out and involves legal costs, pre-trial costs, jury selection, trial, incarceration, and appeals. During some time in the 70s, Massachusetts spent $360 million over about a 10-year period, and during that time they only executed 3 prisoners. That's not a lot of bang for your buck. Furthermore, it is much cheaper to place an inmate on life without the possibility of parole. Just place him as a regular prisoner. Across all 50 states, death row inmates cost 1.12 more than a general population inmate. So as I mentioned in the beginning, there are 737 inmates on death row in California. That means changing them to a general population inmate will save us taxpayers about $800 million a year. Furthermore, the death penalty has claimed many innocent lives. And with technology always advancing, with the death penalty being so permanent, there is no opportunity to go back and fix these mistakes. Now, what do we value the most? We value safety. We look to the government for safety. We expect the government to protect us. So imagine, one day, the government came and took away a child, or a brother, a sister, a mother, or a father, and executed them, put them to death. Years later, you found out that family member was innocent. This has happened 170 times since the 70s. Since 73, 170 former death row prisoners have been exonerated of all charges related to wrongful convictions. This is unacceptable. 170 American citizens have lost their lives for a crime that they didn't even commit. And this is only the recorded cases. These are only since the 70s. This is unacceptable. One would be unacceptable, but this is 170. As I mentioned, technology is always further advancing. Just since the 80s, DNA wasn't a thing. So with the constant breakthrough of technology, placing an inmate in a life sentence without the possibility of parole allows the government, if there is an issue with the legal system, to go back and fix that issue. With the death penalty, they are put to death, that's it. And then years later, they are exonerated and, we found out they didn't do it. That is unacceptable. I would also like to bring to light the structural and attitudinal barriers that are associated with the death penalty. Now, the death penalty actually is in violation of 2 amendments. The first being the 8th Amendment. Now, the 8th Amendment states that the 8th Amendment stops the government from carrying out cruel or unusual punishment, and the death penalty is in clear violation of this. A study came out in the 1880s, or recently, that since the 1880s, 3% of all executions were botched. Now, what does botched mean? Botched means that these executions went out in didn't come out in a way as they were supposed to. Either the inmate died suffocating, they died with chemical burns, or they're basically tortured to death, which clearly violates the 8th Amendment, which, as I said, prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. I believe torturing an inmate to death is cruel and unusual punishment. A specific instance of this can be seen with Dennis McGuire, who was sentenced to death in Ohio. He told observers during his 2014 execution with midazolam and hydromorphine that he could feel his body burning. Furthermore, to execute Billy Ray Eric on August 9th, witnesses said Eric appeared to be struggling to breathe 6 minutes into the execution. This is clearly cruel and unusual punishment. And these are only the recorded cases too. Furthermore, the death penalty violates the 14th Amendment. Now, my opponent is probably going to use the 14th Amendment as reasoning for the legality of the death penalty, and I'm here to show you that the death penalty actually violates that very amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment states, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, property, without due process of law, nor deny to any person within jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." The problem is the death penalty, the system in imposing the death penalty on an inmate is corrupt. It has a racial prejudice. In 2019, nearly 80% of new death sentences were imposed in cases involving victims who were white. 73% of executions in 2019 involved cases with only white victims. So, when there was a white victim with a black offender, the black offender was about 15% more likely to get the death penalty than with a white offender. Now, this clearly shows that due process of law is not equal. The legal system is not equally carried out with each citizen, thus breaking the 14th Amendment. My opponent is probably going to claim that the death penalty needs to be in place as it deters crime, but this may not be the case. Now, when you think of why we have the death penalty in place, you would think it is to deter crime, to stop criminal activity. As a matter of fact, this argument cannot be decided by both ends of the spectrum. In 2003, Emory University economist Paul H. Rubin and Emory law professor Joanna Shepard used data from before and after then recent death penalty moratoriums to conclude each execution prevented 18 murders. However, this argument challenged Yale professors who claimed this argument was surprisingly fragile, as well as claimed the death penalty deters crime is still the product of belief, not evidence. I say, if this is the capital punishment's main argument, and it can't even be proven by both sides of the argument, why do we have the system in place? This is its main argument, and it can't even be proven. As I mentioned, the solution is simple. The solution is to remove the death penalty and instead replace it with life without the possibility of parole. I am dissatisfied with my opponent's proposition to keep the death penalty in place. As I've stated, it causes many problems. Removing the death penalty and instead replacing it with a life sentence without the possibility of parole is the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. We will be saving millions of dollars a year. This money could be placed in the places where it needs to be, helping the communities around us, helping schools, helping education. We will be saving hundreds of lives a year. We will be putting an end to a cruel and immoral and outdated practice. As I mentioned, 70% of the world have put an end to the death penalty. It's time for the United States to hop on board with that idea.